Hey guys, this is Justin. Hello and welcome to another video. Very excited for the next episode of Skeleton Crew. Watch my review if you have not already. Until then, however, we're continuing our hashtag AskX series where I take a look at your questions, usually about lore, and give my best possible answers. And of course, if you've got a question you'd like to see addressed in a future video, leave it down below with the hashtag AskX. This first question comes from DarkBody13. Subscriber, by the way, for 5 years. Thank you very much. They ask, can you talk about what starfighters the Alliance used before they got the X-Wing? The cutscene for the Battle of Camino has a lot of cool ships on the Rebels side. This is a very tough question to answer for a few reasons. For one, when it comes to mainstream media, the X-Wing does typically dominate, and that's really just because of viewer recognition. We know the X-Wing is a Rebel fighter, it's an iconic one with an awesome design. Usually, if possible, it will be used. But it's also difficult to answer simply because of the sheer number of ships the Rebel Alliance used and how they acquired them. We're going to go all the way back to the Rebel Alliance sourcebook because it gives a really good overview of the Alliance's starfighter supply and means of acquisition. First of all, actually getting starfighters was one of the most important tasks the Rebel Alliance Navy had, and that's simply because starfighters were the backbone of their military operations. The Rebel Alliance could not contend with the capital ships of the Empire in straight battles, so as I've discussed in prior videos, they often relied on hit-and-run attacks with hyperspace-capable starfighters getting in, damaging an enemy, securing whatever objective was necessary, and leaving. The X-Wing was actually very rare among Alliance starfighters in that it was actually produced by the Rebels. As the Essential Guide to Warfare explains, the X-Wing was a top-secret project within Incom. However, when the Empire planned to nationalize the company, several scientists escaped, gave the plan to the Rebels, who not only raided Incom factories of available starfighters, but also passed on the plans to the Mon Calamari, the Verpine, and other governments so they could produce their own ships. X-Wings would go on to be very, very effective. The Essential Guide to Warfare talks about the Lightspeed Panther's Wing, which destroyed 286 TIE fighters while only losing 4 T-65s over a protracted campaign. However, they were slow to build. Other starfighters like the A-Wing were also sometimes produced by the Rebel Alliance, and also the B-Wing was a design exclusive to the Alliance, created in Legends at least through a collaboration between the Mon Calamari and the Verpine. But the A-Wing and the X-Wing were less frequently seen than the X-Wing, and again, were both very difficult and slow to build. The vast majority of Rebel fighters, especially before the introduction of the X-Wing, came to the Alliance through several means. I'll go back and quote the Rebel Alliance sourcebook here. The Alliance gained the majority of its original complement of starfighters through the wholesale deflection of planetary and system defense forces after, and this is again an older text, President Palpatine took the title of Emperor and before he had solidified his hold on the Navy. During those months, literally thousands of pilots went underground, joining the growing rebellion. Obviously, the timeline doesn't quite stand up. For a while, it was believed that the Empire already existed, perhaps in some form, before Palpatine took control, but generally, it's pretty much the same. So a lot of early Alliance fighters came from a mix of planetary defense forces, rogues who just happened to join the Alliance, defected Imperials, and others. Things really started to change, however, after the dissolution of the Senate and the destruction and use of the Death Star. Although the tyranny caused people to flock to the Alliance, planets were afraid of outright supporting the Rebels, so the Alliance began to produce more and more of their own ships. So that sort of answers the question. Basically, before the X-Wing saw service, most of the Alliance's fighters were given to them from various groups, often along with their pilots. This is one of the reasons why Y-Wings were quite common. Y-Wings were heavily used in planetary defense forces because they're pretty good, rugged, all-around fighters. They're reliable, you can perform maintenance on them, so lots of Y-Wings end up making their way into the Rebels, especially given the fact that Y-Wings were common given their use in the Clone Wars. I imagine that the Republic not only had their own Y-Wing supply, but also would have allowed planetary defense forces to purchase directly from the manufacturer, because if you can have your planets defending themselves, that takes a little bit of a strain off your military, although somewhat ironically, or I guess not ironically, because really they're still defending themselves, the Y-Wings would make their way into the hands of the rebels. When it comes to other specific ship types, it's really hard to narrow them down. That's why I really like the Battle of Kamino cutscene, and I've done a whole video on why it's a really great space battle for Star Wars Legends, but you can imagine the ships which would have been common in planetary defense forces would have been similarly common within the Rebel Alliance. The Z95, or the Z95 for my American viewers, is mentioned, although that ship typically didn't come with a hyperdrive, so it wasn't great for the Alliance. To be honest, the Z95 was also kinda shitty. But you gotta use what you gotta use, I guess. But it's a similar reason to why you see the R41 or the T-Wing. These were fighters which were cheap enough and common enough to make their way into the Rebel Alliance, a faction which could not produce its own starfighters early on, and also in a galaxy where the Empire was nationalizing shipbuilders. Certainly, there would have been heavy restrictions on what sort of weapons could have been sold to entities outside the Empire. So you're kind of limited. You have old ships and also ships which saw action during the Clone Wars. An N1 starfighter is a great example of this, and we see the N1. It's produced by Naboo. It's very distinctive. It makes sense why you'd see it in Rebel fleets, but there would have been many different variants on ships like the N1, and the early Rebel Alliance Navy Starfighter Corps would have been a hot mess. I imagine the maintenance would have been incredibly difficult. I feel like this isn't the most satisfying answer, but it's really the only one I can give, but it also leaves a lot of room for imagination. If you're running, say, an RPG campaign and you wanted it to be about an early Alliance Starfighter squadron, you could have them in everything from stolen or defected Imperial vessels to crappy starships donated by planetary defense forces to ARC 170s and Clone Wars era ships to eventually the few starfighter classes actually produced by the Rebel Alliance, including the X-Wing and in more limited numbers, the A-Wing and B-Wing. All right, final question, and I like the name, it's kind of appropriate. Machina X Machina asks, I just finished Heir to the Empire, and something that bothered me was how did the mole miners enable Thrawn to take over the New Republic capital ships? And yes, at the Battle of Sluis Von, the New Republic is repairing and building a bunch of ships. Thrawn shows up and tries to steal a bunch of Mon Calamari cruisers and other vessels using mole miners. These mole miners were stolen by Lando. They're just like they sound, essentially small mining platforms. And you pretty much got it. The mole miners were full of stormtroopers who tried to take over the ships by force. Remember, these were under construction and being repaired, so there weren't a ton of people on them. If you remember, the way the battle ends is that Lando activates the mole miners once they're in the ship, which ruptures their seal, and basically all the stormtroopers end up dying to vacuum, except for the ones in the zero-G suits. At the beginning of chapter 32, it pretty much says that specifically, the regular stormtroopers were the easiest. Most of them were dead already, killed when Lando's activation of the mole miners had ruptured their air seals of their stolen ships and left them open to vacuum, and the rest were taken without much trouble. The 8 remaining space troopers, whose zero-G suits had allowed them to keep fighting after the ships were disabled, were another story entirely. But yeah, it almost seems when you're reading it like they could be remotely controlling the vessels, but yeah, that's how it works. Anyway, that's all I've got. The lesson there is don't steal your critical mission thing from Lando Calrissian because he's going to help the good guys. Until next time, guys, be safe, have a good one, and may the Force be with you.